you guys for coming to join us on the first psychedelic track on the first and on International Women's Day. Perfect topic to talk about. Yay! Women's health and psychedelics. So excited to be here. We're all here because we truly believe that psychedelics has a powerful solution for women's health, and we all have personal stories that have brought us together. We're excited to share them with you and really get deep on why we believe that women's health needs to be researched more, and that psychedelics can really provide a solution for that on many levels. So I am Ashley Walsh, CEO and founder of Interstate Inc. I'm a biotech company for psychedelics focused on women's therapeutics. And my story of why I got into this was I was going through a divorce, I was pregnant, it was the middle of COVID, and I thought, okay, there's gotta be solutions here that are better than an SSRI, better than falling apart. And thankfully living in Los Angeles, we have access to microdosing. And I was in the process of weaning my second child. And the first time I weaned my child, it was disastrous. It was fall apart, anxious, a month afterwards, and I thought, okay, my second child, in the middle of all that was going on, I can't suffer through that again. And somebody said, well, why don't you try microdosing while you're weaning your second child? And I thought, okay, this is interesting. It's definitely a little risky, because clearly I was still breastfeeding, but it was tail end of it. And I will tell you, it was dramatic. In the fact that it wasn't dramatic, I felt great afterwards, and I didn't feel like I was gonna have the anxiety and the collapse that I had with the first one. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. I'm gonna continue microdosing. And then the second time it came up a couple of years ago, I thought I was starting to feel some parts of the perimenopause coming on. Thankfully, I had Dr. Suzanne as a friend, and I said, well, how do I mitigate this? What are the herbs and botanicals I can use? Because I want to use natural supplements. She's like, well, I know you microdose, so why don't you try microdosing during your luteal phase? I'm like, all right, let's try that. So I started microdosing every day during the luteal phase. I had a much longer one than most people. And it was interesting because I didn't really want to take it every day. And so I was journaling about it. It's funny, I went back and looked at the journal too. And the up and down of emotions that I went through during that period of time, it was interesting to look back at it and go, wow, there was really an exploration into this. And there wasn't the immediate effect per se. Like I felt some positive uplift, but what was really dramatic was a couple months later going, I don't have perimenopause symptoms anymore. Clearly there were probably other things going on, but it was enough for me to look at and say, wow, okay, I had this effect with weaning, I had this effect with perimenopause. There's something here that's interacting with my hormone cycles, and clearly the microdosing is doing that. So for me, I went, okay, I want to start being a voice in this. I want to look at women's health. How do I do this? Where are the conversations not happening? And so I started looking at the whole mushroom. Can we start looking at the biochemistry of the whole mushroom? Can we look at the different strains and the healing qualities of them, and look at those towards specific indications and pathologies? So currently, my company is doing research with the Ohio State University. We're looking at 15 strains of different psilocybin-producing mushrooms, and we're looking at them for specific pathologies and specific assays and receptors for female receptors, serotonin receptors, and breast cancer cell lines. And it's really to see how do these influence it differently, because each strain definitely seems to have a different healing quality to it based on the biochemistry, based on the entourage effect. And it's great because the research is starting to show that there is more efficacy with a whole mushroom. In fact, there was a study done in Israel a year ago showing that there was more efficacy to the whole mushroom than synthetic psilocybin. Again, it's an open platform. I think rising tide floats all boats. The synthetic psilocybin is useful for specific indications in clinical trials, and the whole mushroom probably has more indications for things like anti-inflammation, anti-cancer mechanisms, as well as the use of psychedelics alongside of it. So that was really my journey into why I started my company. And then I met all of these wonderful people along the way. I said psychedelics is so incredible because people, once you hear that you're in this space, then they open up and it becomes a much deeper conversation. So with that, I'd like to introduce my panel, and I want to pull this up so I make sure I introduce them correctly. So we'll start with Stephanie. And actually, we gotta go through this. I'll pull up your slides. By the way, there's some crazy stats to women's health. I mean, we know 2/3 of Americans over the age of 65 are women with Alzheimer's. 68 of the autoimmune diseases are women's. Women are twice as likely to get PTSD. And 8 million deaths of women dying from cancer. So we've got a lot to do. We've got a lot to cover. And again, these amazing panelists are here to help us with that. So I'm trying to get over to Stephanie. Stephanie is a neuropharmacologist, founder of Beyond Consulting, supporting psychedelic and plant medicine initiatives, and clinical director at Modern Medicine Services, a first of its kind integrated medicine and mental health practice in Los Angeles. And she was the inspiration for starting this panel, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So those facts, can you guys hear me or not really? No, I don't think this is on.
Let me switch you maybe.
Oh, wait, how about now?
If you don't mind, I'm going to switch into the regular microphone.
I'll hold 2 mics.
I
Yay,
apologize.
tech.
I'm going to, yeah. I apologize.
That's okay. Perfect. How about now?
Oh, give me 1 second. I'm going to turn the volume up.
Just hold those like this. Testing. 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 There's no
One more time.
There we go.
There you are.
All right, false start, but now we got it. I'm Stephanie. I'm happy to be here with all of you discussing this very important topic. Despite these incredible stats that Ashley just showed us, women have been typically excluded from a lot of clinical research, and we haven't really studied the biochemistry of females. And so here's an opportunity larger than ever, because we are noticing that there are important intersections between psychedelic medicines and estrogen. We talked about the luteal phase, we talked about how Ashley found success microdosing in this phase, and so essentially, through our menstrual cycle, our estrogen rises and falls twice. Once in the mid-follicular phase, and then after ovulation it dips back down, then again in the mid-luteal phase, and then after the menstrual cycle is finished, it dips back down again. So here's an opportunity perhaps to investigate the relationship between serotonin and estrogen, the relationship between glutamate and estrogen, because these neurotransmitters and neurochemicals that are very much tied into our hormonal response are potentiated by certain psychedelics, the serotonergic kind like MDMA, psilocybin, mescaline. Some of these plant medicines have been used for years throughout these very important transitions in a woman's life. And so we owe it to ourselves to invest and to investigate in this research. I also want to say that in general, we have medicalized things like menopause, right? We have reduced it to a singular hormonal event. And HRT, antidepressants, and other symptom management medicines are used as interventions, and they do have a lot of value, but they don't look at this, this transition as a full experience. It is very neurological, it is deeply emotional, it's even existential, and so there's an opportunity here for an integrative medicine approach. Psychedelics are an integrative medicine. They need to be used as such. This is body, mind, and spirit medicine. And so with integrative medicine, we have an opportunity to move away from this reactive approach to transitions like menopause or postpartum and be personalized, intentional, and proactive. We should be thinking about these transitions early on in life, not from a place of fear or anxiety, but with preparation so that we are in the best state possible, and so we're empowered when we reach postpartum, for example, or menopause. We're empowered when we have agency to ask the questions, to explore other options. If HRT is not the way we want to go, maybe there is a plant medicine, maybe there is a psychedelic, but the conversation needs to happen. So I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to sit here and talk about it, because there needs to be more education, and we need to remove the taboo around these topics. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Well, it's a great introduction to our next guest as well. Dr. Suzanne and I have been friends for a while, and I'm happy to introduce her. Suzanne Gilberg-Lenz is a board-certified OBGYN with 25 years of clinical experience in integrative and holistic medicine. She is the author and founder of Menopause Bootcamp, published by HarperCollins, and Chief Clinical Officer of Monarch MD, devoted to 360-degree care of women. Turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Is my other mic working? Are both my mics working?
Yes, you just gotta talk into it.
Okay. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Wow, that was that was the call to action right there.
We're done. Let's
All right, my job. So, my experience in this area is interesting. It's serendipitous in some ways, like life. I started out my career in medicine, interested in whole life, whole women's care. I've been practicing OBGYN. I actually stopped doing births about 3 years ago now. But I was noticing, I had the privilege and the honor to work with women and families throughout their life cycle. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that we learn throughout our career, or fortunately maybe, is around the practice of medicine, right? It is a practice. We don't learn all of it in our education. I think there's been a lot of discussion recently around how much we don't learn, but I had the very fortunate experience of learning about integrative, holistic, and traditional indigenous medicines very early on in my career, and that influenced me greatly, and that brought me over time to a lot of the plant medicines, botanicals in general, specifically psychedelics, over the last probably, decade or so. And it's a very, very interesting opportunity. So for me, from the clinical standpoint, we showed some stats. I wanna just throw some stats at you guys about the kinds of issues that we see when we are caring for people who identify as women or biologically are women. Endometriosis, okay? 2 to 5% of women experience endometriosis. We know the stats on this are extraordinary in that it can take up to 11 years for people to actually get a diagnosis. This means people are not only suffering for up to a decade of their life, but they're having a serious chronic medical condition that is advancing without treatment, okay? At least 50% of people who suffer from chronic pelvic pain actually have endometriosis, and about 90% of those who have pelvic pain, chronic pelvic pain, are actually women. So this is a big area of conversation. If you look at issues like mood disorders, and specifically look at them linked to hormonal transitions, we know that about 20 to 30% of us will experience some form of premenstrual syndrome on a regular basis, and that's physical and mood symptoms. About 2 to 5% actually have something called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's a much more disruptive mood-based disorder, but also has physical symptoms associated. When you look at the perimenopause transition, 80% of us will experience mood disorder or changes in our mood that are significant and disruptive. 80% during that perimenopausal period. And 20 to 30%, or actually maybe up to 25%, will experience a serious disruptive peripartum mood disorder. So again, these are really significant numbers. I could go on and on. We see a lot of comorbidities. We see pain syndromes coexisting with mood syndromes. It's kind of impossible to unwind, right? Chicken egg. We see much bigger numbers of use of antidepressants in women. By far, globally, women are prescribed antidepressants much more than men, for numerous reasons. So my point here with all of these stats about sort of, and sadly, a lot of these problems are misunderstood. We just don't understand. You guys are so complicated. we can't with the hormones. Why can't we with the hormones? I mean, over half the population experiences these shifts. And then this slide I really want to highlight. This is looking at some very recent data that was produced, published in Nature almost a year ago by our fabulous colleague Lisa Mosconi in New York, looking at the brain changes, and specifically estrogen receptor changes in the brain during and after menopause. So what you see is very interesting. What you see is everything's lighting up, right? Post-menopause. Why is that? This is estrogen receptor density. The density of the receptors increases dramatically post-menopause. Theoretically, we believe, because it is looking for the available estrogen. This is a little bit of a reminder that estrogen, which is not the only hormone that any human makes, okay? Men make a lot of estrogen too. Just side note, older men have more estrogen than older women. I'm gonna say it again. The other thing is testosterone, which is a whole other talk, but as long as we're talking about hormones. Women in their younger years have 4 times the amount of testosterone in their body than estrogen. They don't have as much as men, but we have a lot of testosterone. So I'm bringing these things up because you may have not heard any of these things, and in the scientific community, we are really in our infancy in understanding how these impacts are influencing each other. And I think when you look at potential interventions and therapeutics like psychedelics, we have to understand the differences in not just our brain, but our entire body. So estrogen receptors are not just in the areas that are obvious. They are in your brain. The density of those receptors increases. Why? Looking for available estrogen. So I'm going to stop here so we can tee up the rest of the conversation. I will say one other thing, and I have to thank Stephanie for teeing it up. My big project right now is working in that 360 care of women in midlife. What does that mean? We know that women get a lot of attention up until, fertility is dealt with, pregnancy is dealt with, if that's what they want to do, and then it's kind of a good luck to you. We'll see you when we're ready to diagnose you with your osteoporosis, hypertension, and diabetes. And that's not only crappy humanity, it's bad business. So that's kind of what I'm devoted to now in our startup and my practice, and really looking at the 360 view and prevention and precision, which is another reason why I'm so interested in the psychedelics, which are by definition about reconnecting.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great tee-up for our wonderful next panelist, talking specifically around the different places that estrogen is working within our brain and within our gut. And Dr. Emeran A is gut health expert and author of The Mind-Gut Connection, a world-renowned and award-winning gastroenterologist and neuroscientist. He's accumulated 35 years of research on the clinical and neurobiological relationship between the digestive system and the nervous system. So I'll switch over to this very cool slide.
Yeah, so my origin story is quite different from what you've heard before from my 3 women colleagues here on the panel. I've had an interest in brain-body interactions from the day I went into medicine. That was the main thing that I was interested in from day one. And I have pursued this brain-gut interaction theme ever since in my career, even though at the time nobody really believed in that or thought this was relevant. Now it's a household word, gut health and brain health. So it's kind of satisfying to see that this is happening now. I kind of stumbled into a couple of other things. One was the microbiome. Very early in my career, when I had the opportunity to be on 2 documentary film expeditions to the Orinoco River and to Irian Jaya in New Guinea, and lived with the indigenous people there, and they had their pretty dramatic rituals that we filmed at the time with psychedelic substances. But I was in my first semester in medical school, so this was more like an exciting adventure rather than anything that's thought about in medical terms. So the second thing was living with these Yanomami people on the Upper Orinoco River. We also didn't pay much attention. Microbiome revolution hadn't happened yet, but friend and colleague of mine, Gloria Dominguez, went to these same people 10 years later and analyzed their stool samples. It was found that they had the most diverse gut microbiome and the richest gut microbiome of anybody on the planet. And in retrospect, it became obvious why that is, because of their lifestyle. They're largely plant-based. Their diet, they have very close social interactions with their children. They do all the things that, or have done. I mean, they're almost vanished by now, unfortunately, 40 years later. They do all the things that we recommend. So, and the last piece was also somehow not planned in terms of women's health. So we found that one of the medications we evaluated at the time for irritable bowel syndrome, called allosterone, seemed to be working better in female patients with irritable bowel syndrome. And that kind of started this whole question, what's different? Why does this work different? And fast forward now 20 and some years later, we had heading a center grant at UCLA, offered from the Office of Women's Health Research at the NIH. Hopefully we'll get it renewed despite the political skepticism about woke topics like women's health. And so over the last 25 years, we really focused on to the brain-gut microbiome interactions and why they're different in women and what role estrogen plays and what the interactions between the microbes in the gut and estrogen levels in the body may play in this. So psychedelic experiences, I can't tell you, we have not done any research on this topic. I mean, I wish I was 20 or 40 years younger and started my career with this is definitely the topic I would pick, because I think it's one of the most interesting and promising and wide open research areas. But from personal experiences, that has almost like a life-altering influence on my conceptualization of like a holistic view or a view of interconnectedness, really. I mean, that's really the term that I'm now have been pursuing in all my endeavors, both in my late books, but also in our research. So,
fabulous, thank you. Well, I think that's a great jumping off point about this integrative, holistic viewpoint of women and why this conversation, we are looking at women from many different angles, from the biochemistry to the mental health components and how all of these interact together, and really looking at the multiple opportunities we have for research and understanding women better. And I think one of those, Stephanie is working in integrated medicine office with ketamine, and I think talking to us a little bit about the real world applications, because I think a lot of people, trying to understand legalities, right? Where is it legal? Where is it not legal? We all want to have access to it. And again, that's why we're all here. We want to provide that and find ways. For me, it's about research and changing policy. Stephanie's in clinic working with ketamine. So I'd love for you to discuss a little bit about your experience in the real world with that.
Yeah. So you nailed it. We don't have full access to certain medicines like psilocybin, even though we wish we did. But ketamine is one that we're working with right now, and it is powerful. As I mentioned earlier, there is a relationship between estrogen, female hormones, and some of these psychedelics. So ketamine works on glutamate. That is the neurotransmitter. And we've noticed things like glutamate levels will dip in the mid-luteal phase, which can contribute to mood imbalances or disorders for PMDD, for example, which Suzanne mentioned, which is a more severe form of PMS. And there's a relationship there because ketamine has shown to increase levels of estrogen. It increases the levels of glutamate. And then there's also this synergistic relationship between estrogen and glutamate as well. And the same thing for serotonin and estrogen. Estrogen actually increases the amount of receptors, of serotonin receptors, available for binding. So the opportunity here is, I'm thinking for women, for example, who have these mood imbalances or disorders, women who are postpartum and experiencing blues, depression, anxiety, to use ketamine-assisted therapy as a tool. At our clinic, we are developing integrative medicine protocols that do involve ketamine-assisted therapies. And when I say integrative medicine, I mean also nutrition, lifestyle, supplementation, acupuncture, essentially all of these treatments and services that are supporting the mind, body, and spirit. I'm going to give you an example. Oftentimes we have patients that will come in and they're presenting with one specific concern, right? So someone comes in and says, I'm here because I'm anxious. And so we explore the different possibilities. Do you want to go with talk therapy, psychotherapy? Would you like to explore acupuncture and sound bed? Or do you want to try something like ketamine-assisted therapy? So this particular patient that I'm thinking of has experienced ketamine before, and she found that it was very helpful and supportive for her. She came in for her consultation and ended up also getting some acupuncture, spoke with an integrative medicine physician, and had divulged that she noticed with her PCOS that whenever she did a psychedelic, whether it was ketamine therapy or her ayahuasca journey, she would ovulate regularly for 3 months. Now, things like this haven't really been studied, but there are these anecdotal reports, and she knows that she ovulates regularly for about 90 days, or give or take, every time she has a psychedelic experience. So this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning about how the neurotransmitters and neurohormones that are influenced and stimulated by these psychedelics have a direct impact on our hormones, on ovulation and menstruation. So for her, it wasn't just about her anxiety anymore. It was like, I also want to have children, but we haven't been able to conceive because of my PCOS. Can I work with you guys? Use acupuncture, use the ketamine-assisted therapy, use these different tools, use nutrition to regulate my body, to get into sync with my body, understand it, and also mitigate my mental health symptoms. And so this is a perfect example of this integrative care model that we can apply now using a medicine like ketamine that is available, that is legal, and that does give a psychedelic experience. And it's not just about the medicine itself and the neurotransmitters and the chemical experience. These medicines give you an exploration of your consciousness. So when you're experiencing transitions like postpartum, like menopause, pain, you have this identity crisis. You have these identity shifts, right? You become disconnected with yourself. You don't recognize your body. You don't recognize the way you feel. All of a sudden, you might be turned off by your partner. You're so anxious that going to work becomes difficult, and all of a sudden, your vitality is completely challenged. And so these medicines are not just working on the physical body, but on the spirit, on the emotional connection, restoring the balance. If you're going through menopause, there's a grieving process, right? And so these medicines can support that and essentially restore that connection to self, connection with loved ones. And I think if we had more access to these tools, more education about these tools, we wouldn't just have healthier relationships, we would have stronger partnerships and a stronger society. So I'm hoping that we keep moving towards this integrative care model. I know it's not what we've been trained with, right? And doctors don't have the time to give you a 60-minute consultation, and when they do, it's really expensive and insurance doesn't cover it, but having these conversations and motivating people to ask for that is going to get us there. So yeah,
I think it's a good jump over to Suzanne and talking more about integrated care.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's so important, and I think the other thing that's really important to note here is that for any of you who are just humans on the planet and may seek care at some point, or who are practitioners or practitioner adjacent, it's really, really important to understand what the biological impact may be of recommendations, of timing of therapeutics, not just, not everybody's cycling, right? So just understanding the biochemistry and the timing is super, super important. You don't need to be the expert, but you do need to make sure that that is brought up in consultation, because that is going to have a huge impact. The other thing that we see in terms of integrating is like, look at the panel. We are 4 people who have interests that is in common and complementary skill sets. and knowledge.
We
And
all
that
come from
is,
different places.
yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
different backgrounds.
Yes, exactly. And that is obviously the ideal. Do most people have access to this model? Absolutely not. And that's just the reality. So when we can educate ourselves and continually advocate for a more integrative approach and for expecting better integrative care and understanding what that is, because for me, integrative care, I was board certified in integrative and holistic medicine. What does that even mean, right? For me, integrating care is understanding that, for instance, at perimenopause, your brain is remodeling specifically the hippocampus, right? So, and I understand the unpredictability and the fluctuations that are characteristic of perimenopause. That is the characteristic of perimenopause, is not a sudden event at all. It is a up and down for a very long period of time. I also understand that botanicals and lifestyle are important. I also understand hormone therapy. For me, integrating is remembering that it is a mind-body. It is not a mind or a body. And this idea of it's all in your head, that idea being stigmatized or weaponized is very dangerous. When we buy into these stigmas, that somehow if it's in your mind, it's not worthy, it's shameful. What? That's weird. Because the last I checked, your mind isn't like here. Like what we just are showing you all of these ways that our body itself is integrated. So we have to continue to recall what opportunities we have to integrate. This is really hard in a quote system that divides us up into pieces and parts. It's why people like you are so important, because you are attracted to this, you understand. And again, I'll say it again, my personal experience with psychedelics, I don't use them professionally in my, I'm not, PAP and microdosing, that's not actually how it goes in my office at present, as far as you know, because it's also not me. But my personal experiences have been to fully understand where I am in that moment and how our connections with ourselves create the opportunity for community together, which to me, as a healer, and I consider myself a physician and a healer, I take that calling very seriously. That is why I arrived on the planet in this form. That's my dharma, that's my belief. I don't care how corny that sounds. That's how I feel about it. And that's how I ended up on this right stage, just going with the flow. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like maybe I answered the question, maybe I didn't, but
Well,
I
think ultimately when we're talking about integrative medicine, that conversation around how can you talk about psychedelics being integrated, and that's again the sort of hand-holding that you're dealing with, and why again this becomes a vital conversation, things that are legal with ketamine versus obviously microdosing not at this point.
Right.
And what, and in some ways as a care physician, how do you talk to your clients about this? Like how do you, when they come in and say, I want to microdose, what can you say?
So it's interesting because I practice in West Los Angeles, so I have, I think at this point, because I've been in practice a long time and I'm known to have a background in integrative medicine, people know like I grow plants in my backyard and I make medicine. I have a friend whose nickname for me is Oregano because his claim is that I say oregano does everything for everybody, which is obviously true. So people already kind of know this about me, and I tend to not, okay, so I practice with a medical license in the state of California. My practice is regulated, so is hers, right? So is his. So if somebody, I'm not bringing it up, that's just not happening. In casual conversation, you're my friend, that was a different story. If someone brings it up to me, and you better believe in Beverly Hills, California, they bring it up, okay? I answer, and I tell them, look, it's not legal, I'm not a practitioner, here's what I observed, here's the data that I have read, which is not enough, and you have to be very, very careful. That's a consultation, that is me sharing information which is publicly available. I'm not prescribing, and that's not, hopefully that will be on the menu at some point.
Well, I think-
now.
Sorry if I may, there's something really incredible though about being psychedelic informed. At our practice at Modern Medicine, everyone has been through the psychedelic assisted therapy training, right? And so we create a space where if someone wants to say, hey, I want to try this medicine, what do I need to know, or what should I know, or just has questions about it. It has become a safe space, and I think that's really important because people want to ask their physicians. They don't want to ask Dr. Google, right? And being able to have an open conversation about these things with your physician or with a clinician is huge. So creating that space, being psychedelic informed, or just making people feel very safe is enormous, and I think that providing that is just of great value.
And having, we're lucky, we're in Southern California, we have access to each other, we have access to a lot of really well-informed, clinicians and physicians, and we have amazing academicians like Dr. Mayer who are, again, like I'm not gonna tell people, hey, call.
Right.
But we know who we can talk to and who we can direct our patients and clients to who are gonna get highly vetted, legitimate information.
Well, and I think that really goes to the conversation around creating more information, creating more research, being able to actually turn to something and say, this legitimately does this. And I think that's one of those where, Emeran, you kind of looked at this. What are the opportunities in the space that you're interested in exploring that haven't been looked at? I mean, it's a large umbrella, but for your specific lens.
Yeah, so before I get into this topic of the science of all the topics that we talked about, I do want to emphasize, so like when I started at UCLA, I started a clinic, a multidisciplinary clinic, against the will and the desire of our department chair, who closed it later because he felt it didn't make enough money. We also started with trying to introduce to patients that the brain is important. As Suzanne said, there was a lot of resistance because that would lead to a perception by the patient that you blame it on their psychology, on psychological issues. So many things have happened over these last 30 years, has really changed. I think now most patients embrace that idea of this brain-gut connection and this system that we have. Emotions don't just happen in our mind, but they happen within this continuum. And the gut happens to be one of the main organs, not just because I'm a gastroenterologist, but because all the science supports it's almost like our second brain in complexity and connectivity with the brain. So it's exciting today to see this. UCLA now has an official digestive wellness program, which is basically a repetition of what we started 25 years ago. It's really nice to see that, and listening to you as well, that really supports that. So in terms of the science, some of the things that in preparing for this session, was really interesting to me. I was first looking into this, being a scientist interested in the microbiome world and the way the microbiome communicates with the brain, with the nervous system, to find any evidence of how psychedelics interact with the microbiome. And sadly, there's very little. There's a lot of speculative, some of the interesting review articles, but the science is really minimal. Some people are getting into it. I don't know how the new NIH administration will look at this type of research. We don't know that, but so an interesting idea was that there's different phases to the psychedelic experience. One, the actual high that we have, and the visual and acoustic experiences, and then these more prolonged effects on, including this desire and ability to talk extensively about the experiences, but also then this whole thing of neuroplasticity later. So much different time scale, and so I thought it would be an intriguing idea that the microbes who are much slower, further downstream, would contribute these later components to the psychedelic experience. And so an obvious idea would be that the 5-HT2A receptor is present on the microbes, and by the time the chemical gets down into your distal small intestine or colon, that will trigger these special effects of microbes that will then, we know they produce many neuroactive molecules that play a big role in stimulating serotonin synthesis in these cells in the gut. But to my surprise, there's no published evidence of the existence of these receptors in microbes, in the microbiome. Very surprising because I thought these ancient systems would be linked to each other. One other aspect that came up, which is speculative but very intriguing. So we know that one communication channel from the gut to the brain is the sensory part of the vagus nerve, the vagal afferents. And we know now from work of one of my colleagues at UCLA that there are multiple different fiber types of vagal afferents that have different receptor fingerprints, and quite possible that some of the metabolites, or actually the intact psilocybin or psilocin, would act on receptors, on 5-HT2A receptors, on a subset of vagal afferents that would provide that input to the brain, which could be a plausible mechanism for stimulating neuroplasticity. I mean, the vagus does a lot of different things. That's why we have these subtypes of fibers. But that to me is something that I think research will pursue, both in terms of relatively easy to identify these receptors. There's also crosstalk of serotonin with its different receptors. Even if that particular one is not there, doesn't mean that there's no communication. Another very interesting concept is this phenomenon that our prehistoric diets had a lot of large molecules in it that were not absorbable in our small intestine. So our microbiome basically was this factory, this processing system that would break down these large molecules like fiber, like polyphenols, even early in life, these human milk oligosaccharides. None of them are absorbable, intact, or in any significant form in the small intestine. So the microbes are specialized both out of selfish reasons because it's their food, so any of these large molecular structures like fiber is food for the microbes, but also they produce these beneficial metabolites. So butyrate, short-chain acid, probably the one that has got the most attention, the main product of breakdown and fermentation of large carbohydrate molecules, fiber molecules. Same thing is true about these human milk oligosaccharides that microbes break them down into. The baby doesn't absorb them, so it's not a nutrient for the baby, it's a nutrient for the microbes that evolve and develop and diversify with this input. And so I was looking also for this, to support for this hypothesis, are there large molecular structures in psychedelic compounds? And the surprising answer is no. Most of it is in small enough molecules that are absorbed intact in the small intestine. So two kind of my reading hypotheses, and they've been discussed as hypotheses in review articles without confirmative or negative science behind these speculations, were not really confirmed. So I would say there's a huge hole of the unknown in this whole field. You know, people come up with ideas and then they get into the public mainstream, and people then accept them as reality, and social media influencers propagate these myths. So this field, unfortunately, right now is still full of this, and research has been hampered and slowed down for legal reasons. And then again, I always come back to this, is now we're going to the big unknown. Is this going to become easier? Is this going to be viewed as natural products as opposed to pharmaceutical products? But we don't know that, you know, but I think the excitement around exploring these various possibilities, and I would say for me personally, the neuroplastic effect is something of the most interesting parts. There's virtually no psychopharmacological agent that does that in a reliable way. So you have the effect as long as you take it. If we could demonstrate the mechanisms and the validity of this idea that you really can reprogram a brain that's been damaged or compromised, or there's one aspect in our women's health research, for example, that I think would be also a particularly interesting target. It's this increased stress responsiveness that a part of the population has. 20% of the healthy population, 40% of patients with irritable bowel syndrome, 30% of patients with inflammatory bowel disease. It's sort of like hypertension. People don't know about it. But if you look at the gene expression of a particular gene that activates beta receptor to beta receptor, it's upregulated in these subsets of the population. So you run around with always a drive on your sympathetic nervous system, and when something happens to you, like a trauma or an infection, you will get a much more serious response to that. And women have this to a larger degree. Women that have this increased stress responsiveness also have a greater likelihood of developing these comorbidities. So when you have IBS, for example, very few patients who come to me with IBS just have gut symptoms, as you said. The whole range from fibromyalgia, pelvic pain, migraine, they're not the prominent symptoms, but they have them, and that has to do with this, with this increased latent stress engagement, stress system engagement. And it's a wonderful opportunity to look at would psychedelics with the neuroplastic effects be able, because this trait is something that's both genetically and early environmentally influenced. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a therapy that would reverse this, maybe not abolish it, but tune it down so there's increased risk of developing all these pain conditions and being more vulnerable. Even COVID, so the people who had the most severe forms of COVID was a subset. We didn't look at that, but I would suspect that that's really was one of the mechanisms.
Well, I think that, in terms of seeing all these huge open spaces and what we're looking at to have to really discover more about women and our cycles and individuality and these different sectors within our health, clearly this is why we're all really pressing that research becomes vital. We really need to look at that. And we're curious about what you guys are interested in, so we'd love to have any questions from the audience. If you guys want to come up, I think, to the microphone here, we'd love to hear from you guys.
Can I just make one comment while you guys are coming up to the microphone? I think just hopping on what Emeran just said, when we look at the thorny issues in women's health that we don't quite understand and we frame them more in terms of inflammation, pain, and mood, this is where I really see the sweet spot for psychedelics as an intervention, because we do understand the science better around that. And when we look at things like sexual health, which we didn't really have time to address, when we look at all these basic mind-body impacts, that to me seems like a great way to frame future plans and the conversation going forward.
Yeah, and if I may just say also one more thing. These are also brain network disorders. A lot of us get hung up on the actual hormonal regulation, hormonal imbalance, but when we're talking about trauma, depression, increased stress, these are functional neurological disorders as well, and these are brain network disorders. So I didn't actually tell you guys my origin story, but just to be brief, I studied traumatic brain injury in the ICU, and one of the catalysts for getting into this space was noticing that women particularly, after a head injury or concussion, experience fertility and hormonal issues. And this is because the brain is a predictive machine. It is not homeostatic, it is allostatic. It means that it is always predicting the scenario. So if you're on the plains of Africa and you know that there are lions about, you're not going to wait to see the lion to then have a stress response and run. your brain already knows, and so the cortisol levels are already on a rise. When you have a head injury or you have a brain network disorder, your brain is always in this over-predictive or under-predictive status. Over-predicting would mean more cortisol all the time, which will then lead to the hormonal imbalances. And these are the same things that happen with depression, with anxiety. Our brain can get into these over-predicting mechanisms. And so to your point, the research, there isn't very much. So I just wanted to end with that because you talked about this like chronic state of stress, and chronic state of stress will lead to a whole slew of problems. We know that stress is linked to so many other diseases, so I just wanted to.
And I think it is important, sorry.
There's so much to cover, sorry, we need 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to this, I mean, two things. One is that the brain is the most complex prediction machine in the planet so far. I mean, artificial intelligence will probably surpass it in the near future, but it's definitely something with this increased stress responsiveness. The bias of that system is set in a way that it over predicts the risk. If you think about a self-driving car, which is also based on the prediction algorithm, prediction the next second, minute, 5-minute kilometer away, it makes all these decisions based on these predictions. And if the algorithm is biased in a way that it overreacts, it would stop it every 5 minutes for no reason, for no obvious reason. And I think that's what in a lot of patients happens.
You sure we can have another hour?
Yeah.
Love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for your time and your insight. So I'm from South Carolina, and we are very non-psychedelic pro there. It's a very different landscape than I imagine in California. And so hearing you guys talk, I think there's a level of immense privilege that comes with being able to engage in this type of work, being able to ask these types of questions. And so when you think of groups that live in locations where it's not as accepted or are historically marginalized and face the financial, time, and stigma and religious barriers, all of those things that we see in South Carolina especially. I was just curious to think of how you in your fields see us overcoming that and kind of expanding some of this really revolutionary science to people who otherwise might not be able to access it.
Well, I think I'll take that because that's one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on starting my company was access to people who don't have access to it, and mostly those underserved populations. For me, it's the pathway of can we get this through an FDA botanical pathway? So that's been my focus for research, because then it becomes a conversation that all doctors can have with their clients. And sometimes it's not the same, again, that's the beauty of the psychedelic space. I see that there's, the integrative part, there's the pharmaceutical, there's the nutraceutical. So for me, it was, how do you find access for all? And for me, it's that FDA pathway. So that's my solution to it, and I'm sure they all have different ways of looking at
I was
that.
going to say, find some community. I don't know where you went. Oh, there you are. Find some community. I mean, there are others, I'm sure, in your area that are interested in these topics, and I feel like building community is such a first path of entry, and then you have multiple voices, and perhaps you can lobby. So I feel like having that group, that community, a space to discuss, an open platform, a safe space is also a really great way to start.
But we also, it's interesting when we were sitting here talking, I thought about the concept of weathering, which is something that we talk about in general medical health. And weathering is a concept that people who are in marginalized communities, in my space in women's health, we talk a lot about women of color having weathering impacts, earlier menopause, greater risk of hypertension, diabetes, etc., different maternal mortality. I mean, this is a whole other topic. Bias is, oh my God, enormous. But we also have to look at being sensitive to cultural and, social mores in different communities. And that is why building community amongst those of us who are knowledgeable and interested is super important, because that will help uplift those individuals who are in that community feeling different, feeling like, wait, I see another way. How do I present this in a sensitive, empathic way that will create an opening, not an obstacle? So we need to do that better for each other in this room. those of us that have the privilege are obligated to extend ourselves to those of you who are in situations that are not as privileged. So, I mean, I don't have the answers other than to put that out there and acknowledge that it's true.
I was going to make a comment, sort of like the dark clouds coming up with this. So we're submitting our renewal of our NIH Center grant on Monday. Very stressful time actually to come here in the middle of this. And so what we've noticed at this Office of Research in Women's Health, the website went down like 2 weeks ago. So I don't know if it's been shut down or if it will be shut down. Writing the grant, we got information we have to take out anything about social determinants of health because that immediately would ground the grant. So things are not moving politically in a direction that would sort of support the kind of ideas that we have here. You know, and this is the sad thing.
Yeah, they froze all the research in California for like a solid year. They weren't passing anything that had to do with psychedelics or addiction. Can you believe the labs? They just started to lay off their researchers. It was very panicky. Anyways, it's been resolved, but there's now a backlog of 40 plus studies that need to be pushed through. Yeah, so it's not perfect.
No.
Far from.
Thank you for your question.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you so much. Just briefly, as a Texan, non-medical drivers of health is less of a curse word than social terms. You might want to try that. But what a wonderful session. I'm going to direct a two-part question to you, if I could.
Sure.
I recently jumped into the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy space, and it is wondrous, and I remain optimistic for all of the other substances to come online. You've given me this sort of nuanced lens with which to hold up when I see patients, and the idea of timing or pulsing the dose around a woman's menstrual cycle is something. Do you have a sense of like what the optimal window is? And then the second part of the question is, are you looking at or are you aware of any evidence that is comparing non-dissociative dosing versus psychedelic dissociative dosing of ketamine?
Okay, so the first question, depending on the patient and what you're trying to address. So there's a study, for example, that was looking at postpartum women in China who had all given birth by C-section. When you give birth by C-section, you don't have as much of an influx of the serotonin, the oxytocin, so they're more susceptible to postpartum. They gave a single dose, so it was something like half a mg per kg of ketamine to half the group of women, and the other half just had a placebo. And the group that received ketamine had far less postpartum symptoms. So there was a window there, but we have to think of is mom breastfeeding, right? So Wolfson published a paper last year. The window is about 24 hours, and it's gone.
Pre-luteal phase, or are you just talking strictly on?
Just for the breastfeeding, just for breastfeeding. So if you wanted to try something like this in your breastfeeding, you would pump and dump. 24 hours later, it would be safe to breastfeed again. So you have to be thinking about things like this. If it's a woman who has PMDD, the mid-luteal phase would be the time to engage in a ketamine session. And it seems like getting on some sort of cycle with recurring sessions could be helpful, to the point where maybe then they wouldn't need to come back every single month and they could start to space it out. That's the goal, right?
Absolutely.
So it's taking the time to understand also the women's cycle, what are the chief complaints, what is happening, what are you trying to address? And it's complex. I mean, you said it, they don't want to touch it because we're so complicated, our hormones are so complicated. But the ketamine-assisted therapy, psychedelic-assisted therapy space is very personalized work. It is not one size fits all, and that's the investment. You need to spend time with your clients, your patients. You need to understand them as humans, and you have to understand that things are going to fluctuate for them, and so the care, the protocol is going to fluctuate too. I've seen patients come in, do one dose for 4 weeks, and then they come in on the 5th week, and the dose we gave them, because they build a tolerance now, is more psycholytic than psychedelic, and they're speaking to us through the entire session. Okay, so now we're going to do real psychotherapy facilitated ketamine, right? And so you got to be ready for that. So it's a very personalized space. And then the second question, could you remind me? It was about psycholytic versus
psychedelic.
Okay.
Just trying to find that personalized sweet spot.
Right.
Right now, it remains an open question about whether dissociation is
Right.
required for the psychological benefit.
Right.
And I think it's gonna take us some time to sort of puzzle that out. And I'm just, in your clinical experience, where do you sort of?
Yeah, we've done both, you know, and if you work with like internal family systems and like trying to develop like compassion for the younger self, maybe a psycholytic dose where you can speak to that patient is actually really valuable.
Personally, I like the ability to
Yeah.
engage, like, right there through that process, rather than shooting to the moon and having to wait.
Right, and then we have some patients that come in that do experience full dissociation, ego death. I have a patient that she puts a blanket over her head and she crawls up in her chair, she goes, let me be, and we go in and we check on her every 20 minutes and
I want to be respectful.
yeah, so
That's
it's
great.
again,
We can talk for
personalized,
hours.
very
Thank you.
personalized.
Hi there.
We talked a little bit about access and barriers. I'm from Canada, so the landscape's a little different.
And I'm from Canada too.
Oh, amazing. I wondered about your perspective on going to Europe. I've heard that there's really good treatment in Europe, places like Amsterdam, and if you had a point of view on that.
Kind of depends where.
And what kind of treatment specifically? Just overall looking at psychedelic journeys?
Exactly, and I know a few people who've gone from like releasing and had like prolonged virtual care after doing it.
I think it is country dependent because I know that France is very conservative and I have some friends out there that are having trouble pushing some things along despite there being like a Parisian psychedelic society. Like in the UK, there's Dr. Grace over there from the UK, Histelica. You could talk to her, she's very knowledgeable what's happening in the UK. But yeah, I think it really does depend
But
where you
safe,
are.
like if you do your research and due diligence.
Yeah,
it's
of
safe.
course. I think so.
Thank you.
And in Canada, there's the SAP program, which is great.
I'm from Canada too, specifically BC, we have all the drugs.
Yeah.
I'm an integrated practitioner and I would be on the planet without microdosing. Perimenopause is a bitch that I didn't want to be friends with, so we're fighting right now. As an integrative therapist, my question is kind of more for the doctors. I'm looking for language for my clients to use when they go and see a professional. Because specifically owning vagina, we come in and often get dismissed as, you know, that whole hysteria piece that's so embedded in our medical system. Globally, it seems, not just in North America. So my curiosity for you guys is, what would it look like as a practitioner? How could you be more receptive to the language of a potential client coming in going, I don't know what the fuck's going on, instead of like, you know what, here's some escitalopram and trying to get some naps.
I mean, that's a complicated question, but the simple answer is it depends on where your client or patient is going to the physician. So I can tell you about the experience in the United States. First of all, people need to be as prepared as possible in understanding their experience so that they can advocate for themselves. That's number one. In my book, I have a couple of pages of advocacy, how to prep for a visit, and how to, number two, that physician is your partner. If you come in with guns blazing, I'm not sure how you think they're going to respond, but your physician is a human being. Number three, if you come into your annual visits in an insurance-based practice and you think you're also going to have a full perimenopausal consult, which is most likely going to be requested as my hand is on the door leaving the room, and I understand why, it's not happening. So we have a huge, huge crisis in medical care here, specifically in the US. Your doctors are under fire. They are so broken and hurt by this system that is hurting all of us. We have to have compassion. So there are a number of ways, if you're specifically talking about getting more integrated care or getting perimenopausal care, reaching out to telehealth companies that only treat this. So their practitioners are trained, and this is what they do. That's one option. Another option, making an appointment that's dedicated to your specific concerns and being prepared, and also potentially being prepared to work over a long period of time, because as anybody will tell you, perimenopause is not a one-day event. So I hope these are really practical tips that will help. It's not perfect. We don't have a system that's working at all right now.
I think that's what I was looking for, more of validation of like, okay, so what would preparation look like? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Hi,
I'm sure I'm like the last person to talk, but I just wanted to kind of give a personal experience. I have 2 kids, so I had postpartum depression, PMDD, and I just want to let you guys know that I'm a Texas native. I'm from East Texas, a super small town, so I haven't had access to anything. I'm a student of the universe, like I have no resources. I'm just learning as I go. And I would say that this year, my life has completely switched from psychedelics, and I'm pretty sure that everyone in here has had their own personal experience, and that's why you're here. But I was put on Prozac. I have tried to commit a few times. I dealt with addiction and using psychedelics, specifically psilocybin. Don't ask how I get it, but microdosing has changed my life. And with PMDD during my luteal phase, I've noticed that that's the absolute only thing that has changed. It took me out of addiction within a day, an experience that I had, and I haven't looked back in over a year. So I'm just super passionate about it, and I want to help other people. I don't know how to help people in Texas. I did the life school, so now I'm in real school to try to learn about psychology and help with addiction myself. But yeah, if there's anyone in Texas here that wants to meet up, let me know. But yeah, just thank you for everything.
So I was going to ask you, so, I mean, what do you think is the solution in a state like Texas? Not just Texas in the US.
I think to just be radical and just be loud, because like y'all are from, like she was saying.
There are people in Texas, though. There are people in Texas who are doing
I'm
this.
looking for it
I
now.
can give you some.
Look me up. Yeah, I have 2 sons. I have a 1-year-old, so I'm just now like getting back into life. But yeah, no, I think it's just obviously the higher ups aren't about it. So I mean, do it illegally, man. I don't know. Meet up, go underground, clear your way out. I don't know, but I just think it's meeting up, having communities, being loud, being proud, showing people like why are they hiding it if it's obviously working? Like why are you shutting us up if y'all just want money? Like we're trying to build a better humanity here. So I think it's just spreading the love.
I mean, the sad thing is, this happened already 50 years ago and has
we're in the new
slowed
wave.
down.
I think
So
there's
now
I think there's a shift in consciousness happening. I think that as a one mind, we're kind of waking up a little bit. And I think if we do it the right way, you never know. We're either gonna all die or we're all gonna survive.
Thank you everybody for coming. It was great. No other questions, I'm assuming. Good. All right, well, and the few people left, find us at these locations.
Oh yeah, we're hosting a Women's in Psychedelics event on the 10th at noon at Big Shakti here in Austin. You don't have to be a professional in this space. Come as you are, come learn, there's going to be beautiful art, and yeah, we'd love to see you there.
And Beyond Consulting is Stephanie's company. And Interstate's my company, Monarch MD, and Emeran A, MD. If you're looking for us, they're on the website. Thank you guys so much, appreciate it.